Today we're actually going to be looking at the very sort of south of France, and just to basically recapitulate what we've looked at and at our themes. In the first lecture we looked at the Riviera, and in particular the light and the climate, the vegetation, and the way in which it affected the painters who went there more or less at the middle part of their career or at the end of their career, and actually start out in a new direction, such as Matisse with his flattening and his bright colours. We had Renoir, who of course enters this sort of Arcadian, timeless style. This is because of the idea of the Riviera, with its idea of hedonism and warmth and light. We also looked then at Provence, which was a much more austere environment, insofar as you had these very large limestone mountains and the dark colours around. And this, of course, affects the way in which Cézanne will paint, going away from the momentary style of Impressionism to the eternal structure of reality. And it also, of course, affected Van Gogh very much as well, with the sort of the vibration of light and the sort of joyousness of creation. Well, what we're looking at today, or the painter whom I'll be looking at today, is Toulouse Lautrec. And there is a slight difficulty with the theme that I've been attempting to carry on here, with the idea of a painter being very affected by his physical environment. Toulouse-Lautrec, unbeknown to me, made this statement: "Only the human figure exists. Landscape is and should be no more than an accessory. The painter exclusively of landscape is nothing but a bore. The sole function of landscape is to heighten the intelligibility of the character of the figure." Well, not to be put out, I have managed to mould this, despite what he says. I have managed to put him into this theme. And the way in which that I'm going to look at it is that he is historically extremely influenced by his environment. What do I mean by that? The fact is that he is one of the last descendants of the Counts of Toulouse, who were involved in this extraordinary crusade, the Albigensian crusade, this historical environment of the courts of courtly love and the troubadours. And he, because of the consequences of being born into an aristocratic family which is basically sort of petering out, he physically has certain deformities which force him to go to Paris to paint in a particular way. In fact, his name actually shows how he is embedded in the landscape. I mean, his name is Toulouse, the capital of this area, and Lautrec, another small town nearby, and his mother was the Countess of Céléron, which is another town there as well. So he sort of carries in him very much this idea of the south. This is an interesting painting or portrait of him by Boldini, who painted at this time in Paris, where Boldini has chosen to show him as a dandy, as really a flaneur, very much in the mould of Manet, rather than showing him as Toulouse-Lautrec showed himself, as a rather grotesque figure, living sort of desperately on the edge of society and existence. So this is the countryside that he was brought up in, which you really cannot, I suppose, in many ways, set aside from its history. This, of course, is one of these little Cathar castles. Right, this is Montségur, where the whole thing finished. But this landscape around Toulouse is dotted by very steep mountains with castles or little fortresses on the top, which relate very much to the history of the area, as we'll see in a moment. Now, what do we get from Toulouse-Lautrec? We get his insight into a whole culture of the Belle Époque, an insight into the way the emerging working class cabaret scene and the emerging scene of women who are performers and stars in their own right. and also the sort of the underbelly of the Belle Époque, which of course is painted by Tissot and Béraud, all these lovely ladies in their crinolines. This is the exact opposite. So that's one of his legacies. From the point of view of art, there are two legacies. Firstly, the development of posters, which he starts here with the ones that he did for the Chat Noir and for Aristide Bruant, which have great indebtedness to the Japanese art and the Japanese prints of the time. And through the importance of sinuous lines and in particular large blocks of colour, he will influence the Fauvist movement as well. So he's painting more or less at the same time as Gauguin, for example. The other contribution that you will get from Toulouse-Lautrec will be this idea of the artist as the bohemian tragic figure. Right, you already have something at the end we saw with Van Gogh, the artist as tormented genius, and here we have Toulouse-Lautrec, who dies actually at the same age of 37 from syphilis and alcoholism, two of which these afflictions helped bring about the demise of Van Gogh. Now, I just wanted to have a quick look at the status of the artist during the 19th century. You know, we always have this idea of people say they're an artist in Paris, that they must be starving in a garret. In fact, it was a very small minority who lived in this way. Those who were the salon painters, and particularly up and towards the middle of the 19th century, were extremely important figures in French cultural society. Here we have Meissonier, and those of you who came to those lectures that I gave will remember that he was feted. He had every level of the Legion of Honour. He had every possible medal and decoration. He represented France as he was lionised as the great figure of culture. And here you have him in his studio, which is not, as you see, a sort of a dump with a stove in the middle. You know, here he is with his priceless antiques and sort of the ambassador who's dropped in to sort of, gasp with awe as the master puts one stroke on the canvas. Here we have also, remember we talked in the last series about Bouguereau, who was the great salon painter of these nude ladies who are actually supposed to be virgins of one sort or another. And here you have him again in quite an extraordinary wealthy studio, sitting on this isn't a milk crate, by the way. This is some exotic antique that he'd brought back with him from Morocco. So he, along with people like Rupert Bunny, all live in the Rue Notre-Dame-des-Champs, round near Montparnasse, and this is an extremely wealthy street. If you said you had your studio there, and they're still there, by the way, absolute mansions. Well, I just wanted to quickly give a nod to the exhibition which is on at the moment, where you can actually see footage of the studio of Gustave Moreau, again a bourgeois mansion in the 9th arrondissement, which is just below Montmartre. So you've really got these two levels, as we know, of artist studios. Those that go up to the Boulevard de Clichy, very bourgeois, and after that you get these sorts of things in Montmartre. The Bateau Lavoir, of course, where Picasso and the others began to paint. So I'd like now then, having looked at his legacy, I'm now going to look at the history of the region, and then in the last part, the second part, I'm going to look at the work of Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, when you think of Toulouse, you often think of it as being in the Languedoc region. In actual fact, after the French Revolution, France was divided up into these départements, each of which has a number. You know, if you're driving behind a car in France, it'll have a number on it, and that is according to which département it comes from. All right. So what used to be regions, and this region all around here, pre-revolution, used to be Languedoc. All right. It's now, the only part that is now the region of Languedoc is here. So if you buy a guidebook which is Languedoc-Roussillon, you're not going to get Toulouse in it, because Toulouse is in Midi-Pyrénées. Now, I wanted then to talk about the division of France. Now, if you went back to the time of the Roman invasion of France, which is pre-Julius Caesar, you get this area which is known as Occitania, which actually also extended further down into Spain, and it was originally called Narbonensis. All right, this is what the Romans called it. So Rome divided Gaul and the upper part of Spain into three large regions. And those of you who know your classics, you know, Julius Caesar starts out his history of Gaul with Gallia divisa est in partes tres. Gaul is divided into three parts. And of course you have the north, which is Gaul, you have the west, which is now Aquitaine and all that area, and you had all of this part down here, which was sort of Narbonensis, which became Occitan. Now, it became known as Occitania, again, because of this division in the language. I spoke about this last week. When the Roman legions actually came down, of course, they speak a form of popular Latin, not the Latin that, you know, you read with Cicero. It's already a much more popular version, but they often remain and implant their language on the local populations. So depending on what the local population spoke before, you're going to get a variant of Latin, which will be one of the Romance languages. And this is why when you talk about France and Italy, you get all these different so-called dialects. They are all Latin, which has been interfered with by the local speech, or what is called the substratum. So that's why you're going to get Catalonian, Spanish, Provençal, Niçois, you know, to name just a few. They all have the same roots, but they have been deformed in different ways. That's why you get cheval, caballo, and so on. And it comes from slang. I mean, that's the word. The word in Latin, for example, is caput, but in French and, you know, in Italian, all of those things, it's testa, because the Roman legions used to speak in slang. They used to talk about their old tile, which was a testa, and say, oh, my old tile's sore, and that's why you get that word coming in as head. Nothing to do with the lecture, but anyway, just thought it was interesting. Anyhow, so you get this language barrier in many ways here, with those people in the north who use Latin and say hic for yes, and that is deformed into oi. So you get longer doi. The people who speak that are in the north, and from this area down, they say hoc for yes, which becomes longer doc, and this region becomes called Occitania. And it will be the area in the high Middle Ages where the culture of France is going to flourish, not in the courts of the north. It is all around this area that we're looking at, which will be the powerhouse of the troubadours, of the literature, and the language of culture was Occitan. And of course, when the French, in other words, the people from the north, in the crusade come down and flatten them, or flatten their culture, they impose their language as well, and to some degree it is a weakening of this very vibrant culture. So we look now at Toulouse, which was the Roman Tolosa, and you can see in the centre it's got the classic, you know, grid of Roman structure, although it doesn't seem to have the amphitheatres and so on that you have in Arles and Nîmes and the Maison la Romaine. It is dominated by the cathedral that we'll look at before, and is built on the river Garonne. So it meant that it was a very important trading port for the Romans on its way down to conquer Spain. You then get the Canal du Midi, which branches off from the Garonne, but which is made much later to carry the woad and pastils up to the north. And I'll talk about that in a moment. Now, this is the town hall, which is called the Capitole. Our hotel's actually just going to be off this square here. It bears witness to the fact that in the Renaissance times there was this huge flowering of trade with Toulouse. Sort of it's more or less not flattened, but it's reduced in importance during the 12th century, but comes into itself at the time when they discover woad, which is used, of course, as an indigo to dye clothes. And this meant that the families who could control it were immensely wealthy. So you get this whole town spotted by large Renaissance hotels. And this Capitole here was built for the people who, these people from these families become the councillors or the capitol of Toulouse. Now you'll notice this cross here, and I'll actually talk about that in a minute. Now Toulouse was Christianized, if that's the correct term, quite early. There were, of course, 7 bishops or 7 people sent out to proselytize in France. One of them you will know, Saint-Denis, who becomes the or the bishop or the martyr or the patron saint of Paris, and all of these people go in for rather over-the-top gestures of martyrdom. He, remember, don't forget, carries his head for several kilometres before he actually puts it down. Another person you have is Saint Trophime, of course, who you get the Romanesque church at Arles named after him. And in Toulouse, you get Saturnin, whose name will be shortened to Cernin in Occitanian. Now he and another one of his mates, Saint-Firmin, work on the south here, the south of what is now France. And Saint-Firmin goes down to Pamplona. And of course he's the patron saint of Pamplona. Now the reason I mention this is because on the Roman grid, going right to in the centre of Toulouse, there is a church called Notre Dame du Tour, Our Lady of the Bull. And it refers to the martyrdom of Saint-Cernin. Evidently he was going past the Capitol that we saw, where a bull was supposed to be being sacrificed, and he was getting a bit pesky. Every time he went past, the oracles wouldn't speak, and that sort of thing. So they decided to get rid of him, and he was tied to a bull, a mad bull, and you see the bull's looking a bit confused, dragging him, mitre and all, through the streets of Toulouse. Now where he finally was killed, 2 people found his body, and this church is built. Now what is interesting about this is that in this area, in this grid of streets where you get Our Lady of the Bull, you also have it in the street of Moritor Tau, in other words, the street of the killing of the bull, and there's another whole area around there called the Killing Field. So it's quite possible, in fact you get these bulls all the way around in the architecture as well. It is considered that probably what has happened is that this is reference, this idea of Saint Saturnin being dragged along by the bull, is a reference to the conflict between Christianity and Mithraism at the time. Now, some of you will have known about Mithras. When we were in Rome, remember we went down to see the Mithratic temple underneath San Clemente. It was the other religion of the legionnaires. The legionnaires who weren't in Rome were usually from the working class, and also lived extremely difficult lives and needed to have sort of some belief in an afterlife, something slightly more spiritually elevating than, who was the latest love of Jupiter. I mean, it was almost really basically like sort of Hollywood, what was going on Mount Olympus. They needed something which could inspire them more spiritually. And so the Mithratic religion is more or less flourishes between about the 1st century AD, or was it BC, AD to the 4th century, and then dies out. And it was the groups of people, it was a male religion, there's no reference of women ever having belonged to it. They met in sort of underground caves, or always in something under the ground, and this is one of the reasons why some of them have been preserved very well. And at they had an initiation ceremonies that you had to go through. You had different levels at which you had to graduate until you became a pater, which was almost like a priest, but it wasn't anything like Christianity. But they worshipped Mithras, who is probably thought to have come across from the Iranian or Zoroastrian, being inspired by them. And Mithras slays the bull ritually, and from the slaying of the bull, you get this sort of regeneration, and he rises again, shakes hands with the sun, rises in a chariot, and is reborn. And many of the ceremonies of Mithradism were taken up by the Christians. For example, the communal meal at the time of the death or the slaying of the bull and Mithras, and also at that time they had cakes with little crosses on them, which were taken over. So there were many sort of similarities, and it's thought that quite possibly this reference to Saint-Sernin and the bull relates to this Mithratic religion, which fought very hard for survival against Christianity. It was eliminated eventually when you get Constantine in the Battle of Milvian Bridge. Remember, as a vision of if he will fight under Christ's or the banner, he will be saved. And so he adopts Christianity and makes it the official religion of the Roman Empire. And that really is the death knell of Mithratism. But you still find the altars, even, for example, up in Britain, near the wall between Scotland and England. There are a number of these tribes. Now, so it is thought then that this cross, which is the cross of Languedoc, these 12 knobs that you have here possibly refer to the 12 signs of the zodiac, because the other interpretation is that it had some kind of astrological symbolism. Nothing's been written down, so no one really knows what went on, but this is possibly the shape of him, and the cloak could possibly be the constellation of Orion, which is above the constellation of the bull, that it all was to do with stars going across the skies. And so then this idea that these things that are on the cross come to some degree between this fusion of the two religions. Now, why am I telling you this? It's because there's this sort of already in the South, there's this idea of resistance to the main religion of Christianity. And we're going to sort of see this in the resistance of the Cathars to the Roman Catholic Church. Now, Saint-Sernin, then his body then is taken from Notre-Dame-du-Tour and buried in this huge building, which is built in about, I think it's early Romanesque, so it's about 10th century, built out of beautiful red bricks. And so Toulouse is known as the sort of red capital of the South. Everything are these lovely red rose-coloured bricks that light up under the sun. And it's an extraordinary sort of architecture, as you can see. Here you have the radiating chapels. Huge. They build huge preaching or pilgrim churches, because now people are pouring down to visit, in the High Middle Ages, relics were incredibly important, the connection between this world and the next, physical representation, the bones of this man who is the intermediary. And of course it was on the road to Santiago de Compostela. Unfortunately, during the 19th century, it sort of fell into disrepair, and of course in the 19th century you get this renewal of the idea of French identity, particularly with Mérimée and Viollet-le-Duc. And he is commissioned in the 19th century to renovate the church, or restore the church. And his idea, of course, of restoration is very controversial, that you restore a building to one period. All right, so a church which has evolved from the 10th to the 12th century will be brought back to the 11th or to the 10th, and if it's not that, he gets rid of the other elements. So he did that with Saint-Sernin, and it has only recently now been restored to its original status, which is a hybrid building, basically. Now, you have other great monasteries, because it was a church, a town of pilgrimage. You get this enormous sort of convent or monastery of the Augustins, who set themselves up there. And in it now you have a most wonderful collection of Romanesque sculpture, particularly ecclesiastical sculpture. These were actually gargoyles which were on the building, and they make a most spectacular sort of line-up. I mean, they're obviously sitting up in the wrong direction, but you can actually get up close and see how grotesque they are. but also upstairs it has the most wonderful collection of 19th century art. Here you can see a Delacroix, there's some Gérôme, then of course there's the modern ones, there's some Toulouse-Lautrec, but a lot of the artists from the Salon. Now, I want to actually look then at the situation in the 12th century. Now, again, we've sort of seen this structure before where, of course, France was not the hexagon that we know today. This part here, of course, was under the Plantagenets, right? Eleanor of Aquitaine had married, in her second marriage, the Henri of Plantagenet, and so all of this part is under their rule. This is what is known as France, the kingdom of the Franks, and of course the capital is Paris. Now they're basically a relatively uncouth lot in comparison to these people of the south and to the people around Aquitaine and Eleanor of Aquitaine, who takes the civilization of this area over to England as well. Now down here we have the kingdom of Aragon, of course, and then you have the kingdom of Castile. So you see that Spain hasn't been constituted as Spain yet either. Now, the man that we're going to be talking about is Raymond, Count of Toulouse, all right, 1156 to 1222. Now, the Counts of Toulouse were an extremely powerful family. When you sort of think of old Count, you know, maybe it's not much. He was their equivalent of kings, and of course he had links to all of these other parts. Now, in his first marriage, he married several times. I mean, you had to, if you had to, you know, build up those links, you know, networking. He managed to marry the daughter of the King of Aragon. So Pedro of Aragon then is his father-in-law, all right? So in other words, he then has very strong alliances here. And here you have England and Aquitaine. Now, by his second or maybe his third marriage, he marries Joan Plantagenet, right, who is the sister of Richard the Lionheart and John of England. Right, so that makes him then an ally of the Plantagenets and down here, and a son-in-law of Eleanor of Aquitaine. And many of these other people here were in vassals to him as well. So he had very, very powerful connections, and it looks as though he knows it, doesn't it? I mean, he's not sort of the modest, shrinking type. All right, now this then is the way in which it looks like this was what he owned, but all of these other viscounts of Béziers and Narbonne all were, owed allegiance to him. So if you look at this, you can see the complex structure of the political map of France at the time of the 12th century. Now, at the court of Raymond VI, so we're looking at the sort of mid-12th century, which is a kind of mini-Renaissance in many ways. You're going to get the cult of Mary, which is going to be developed as well. You get the beginning of the troubadours. Now, the first troubadour poetry was written in the Languedoc, right, in the Occitanian language. And the first troubadours were noblemen. The first one was actually one of the Dukes of Aquitaine, who some of his work is still extant. And gradually it became, as the century grew on, it was a much wider field of people who began writing these songs. Now, the troubadour culture starts, I suppose, in about the 11th century, rises to a height probably at the end of the 12th, and then gradually dies, particularly at the time of the Black Death in the 14th century. Now, these people were very important for the transmigration of culture. Bernard de Ventadour, for example, one of the most well-known troubadours, we still have 45 poems that he wrote, fell in love, if we'll talk about that in a moment, with a lady from the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine, and then moves with Eleanor of Aquitaine over to England, and so therefore takes this tradition with him. So by the end of the 12th century, the style of poetry will have been diffused from this court in Toulouse into Spain and into Portugal, and even into Italy. Some people sort of think that Dante uses it as his basis. Now, the origin of the word troubadour, there's a lot of not controversy, but ideas about how it comes about. Most people think it comes from troubar, which is a verb in Occitan, which means to create, but which makes it, you think that it probably comes from this region, but there is now another thought that it also comes from an Islamic word which means to sing. I think it's troubadour or something like that. And so the idea is that possibly this first troubadour, who was the Count of Aquitaine, met it as he came back from the Crusades, as he would have come up through Andalusia, up through Muslim Spain, and would have been influenced that way. Now, you have to distinguish between people who were troubadours originally. Now, I think what we see, these are from manuscripts. Often we sort of see people playing instruments and think they're troubadours. Actually, the troubadours were the creators and the writers and the authors. And it's only later that they actually perform them. And people who just perform them were called jongleurs, which we get juggler from that. Now, these were people from yaciatores in Latin, meaning someone who plays. So you had two distinct levels of people. Those were performers and those who were creators, and they gradually emerged. Now, the great subject, of course, of these troubadours was the idea of courtly love. And the idea of love that was put forward here trickles down very much into the Romantic era and relates very much to our idea of romantic love as well. Particularly this idea of, obsession, undying, constantly being obsessed with thoughts of the loved one. One's life is just one constant search for love and so on. And also love as being something which has an element of, if you indulge in it, it's the end of it. And it says sort of here, this courtly love was a love at once illicit and morally elevating, passionate and disciplined, humiliating and exalting, human and transcendent. So we're all into that, I'm sure. Now, the basic idea behind it is quite possibly that it had origins as well with the church, because some of the troubadours would have been trained by the church. They would have had to have elements or knowledge of music and of singing and of composition. And possibly it was a civilizing idea of the church, trying to change this idea of love as being respect for the virtue of someone else, respect for the independence of someone else, and bringing theological ideas into the secular field. But whatever it is, it certainly has a great emphasis on the role of women, women as a civilizing force. Women were the knight, for example, was supposed to pledge, his undying love to a woman who is basically distant. Right, that was the first thing. Now, this probably would be, the woman would be the wife of his employer. And don't forget that most of the knights were off at the crusade, so often you had very powerful women looking after domains. And these other people who would be pledging their love were often minor knights. Now, you have to remember that it wasn't all clanking in shining armour in those days. It was a pretty dismal life that you lived. And children of one court were of noble lineage were sent very young to another court to be brought up as pages and to become knights there. So in other words, children were taken away very young from their parents, and so to some degree attaching themselves to these women was a sort of, well, not exactly as a mother figure, but you can see it was a softening of this ghastly sort of life that these itinerant knights lived. And also, I mean, it can't have been much fun. I mean, basically going from one war to the next. So you have this idea of the lady, who you choose, you will worship her basically, and the idea is that you will do anything that she desires to make yourself worthy of her. Well, we all like that, don't we, ladies? And the knight sort of sat at the feet of women and was taught as a student. He was taught to curb his desires. He was taught self-discipline. He was not to mock people who were in distress. He was to help the weak. He was not not to laugh and have dreadful table manners in the presence of women. So in other words, it's very much a sort of civilizing process. And it possibly also had something to do with the Marial cult of the time. It's come down to us. The iconography of it, here's a little mirror that you get, and on the back of it you've got this idea of love was then translated into feudal terms, so that you besiege the castle of love. So here you have him besieging the beloved and finally managing to meet her. And of course the whole ideal collapses after a while, and it becomes much more sort of illicit meetings and sort of a little bit of hanky-panky being carried on. But you do get this idea of abstinence and respect and this lack of physical sexuality coming through very much in the Tristan and Isolde legend, which then forms the idea of romantic love. That you can only remain faithful to someone who is constantly unattainable. All right, and this is really what this idea was about. This was a spiritually uplifting type of love. Now, this is what we get, with Leighton in 1900, Godspeed. You get this mustachioed knight racing off, and the sort of lady here leaning over, the idea of softness and innocence and toughness and heroic courage and all of that sort of thing. Now, after the Albigensian crusade, Toulouse does recover to some degree and continues to have competitions for poetry and different types, lyric poetry and so on. And the best thing that you can get is a golden violet, which is the symbol. In fact, the violet is the symbol of Toulouse. Well, going back to our friend Raymond VI, who is this very powerful man, but a cultured man, he's also a man who's extremely tolerant. And going back to this idea of this area of France as being slightly not receptive to mainstream Christianity. And at this time you have a heresy which has developed in about the 11th century in all of the south, which is the heresy of the Cathars. Now, Cathar was a name which was given to them, meaning the pure ones. You get from Greek, it's the same root as cathartic. They didn't call themselves that, that's what they were called by others. Now, the belief seems to have come across from the Byzantium Empire, possibly brought along by some of the Crusaders, and it is the Manichaean belief. In other words, a belief in dual powers in the world, a struggle between the powers of darkness and light. In other words, sort of love and power. And the way in which the Cathars saw this was that the world, in fact, the physical world, had been created by the powers of darkness, the usurper god, the demiurge. So in other words, material world, or power, is the material world, and this is evil. And the body and the material world that we live in is putting out the eternal sort of spiritual light that we have within us. And basically, life is a pursuit of liberating oneself from matter, liberating oneself from power, the physical bonds of the body, and all forms of greed and matter. And this can be done progressively. If you can't do it in the first life, you will be reborn and you will continue your progress towards the light. So in other words, it's a belief in reincarnation. Now, these people did not believe in killing, they didn't believe in capital punishment, they didn't believe in oaths. They were completely different from the Catholics of the time, right? Because the Catholic Church, of course, had this idea of God having created the world, and therefore for the Cathars this was the god of darkness. Also, of course, the other problem with Roman Catholicism is that you have Jesus being made man. Well, of course, being made matter, put into a corporal form as well, is something that they would not have thought was right. And so therefore you have the problem of the incarnation of Jesus, and you have the problem of the Eucharist. And also the problem of the idea of hell. Hell is this world that when you die, there's nothing more to worry about except reincarnation, right? So all of this meant that it really was a great challenge to the Catholic Church. And Pope Innocent III attempted to, send people out to argue with the Cathars, didn't get anywhere, and finally sends out a papal legate, Castelnau, who is murdered at the court of the Count of Toulouse. Now, it's probably one of those great setups of history. I mean, he needed an excuse to preach the crusade. Well, he does, and he preaches it to the French king. The French king, Philippe Auguste, is not interested. He's busy doing, killing somewhere else. And so Innocent III says to the knights of the French kingdom up there, anyone who comes into this crusade will be rewarded with the lands of the people that have been dispossessed. And so you get all of the knights of the north, of that Frankish kingdom that we saw before, collecting and amassing at Lyon 10,000 knights against the south, led by Simon de Montfort. Right, you can see this is his banner here, and this is the siege of Carcassonne. Now, this led to extraordinary atrocities. As you know, I'm sure you've heard of the stories of the Albigensian crusade. Finally they came down to Béziers, and all of the citizens of Béziers took refuge in the cathedral, and they said, well, how are we going to tell who's a Catholic and who's not? And they said, kill the whole lot, God will recognise his own. Those who he then went on to Carcassonne. There was a massacre at Carcassonne. Those who survived were then brought out blinded, their lips and ears and noses cut off, and one person was left with one eye, and he had to take 200 prisoners to all of the towns around to show what would happen if you didn't give in to this, this crusade. Now, the Dominicans, of course, are going to be involved in this. Now, this was Carcassonne at the time. This is where people took refuge. I'll talk about that another time. Here we have the quite kindly-looking crusaders helping these people out, who were the Cathars. Now, once the Cathars had been, defeated, once they had actually, if they weren't murdered, burnt at the stake or anything like that, they were forced to wear a yellow cross. So that, very much the beginning of the idea of the Jews wearing a yellow star, that the Christians who were Cathars had to wear the yellow cross. Now, this went on. Finally, the last sort of stronghold is, as you know, at Montségur, which finally falls, and the 20 of the Parfaits. Now, the Parfaits were the Cathars who actually were like a priesthood. It wasn't a priesthood, but they were people who took the consulatum. In other words, they pledged themselves to purity, to abstinence of all types. They were all vegetarians, by the way. In fact, they were vegans. And the others were just the believers, the credentes, and all of these 20 were burnt at the stake. Now, the reason why this had to be stamped out was because the counts, they were protected, the Cathars were protected by most of the counts at the time, and so warfare went on for 20 years. This crusade wasn't just a one-off strike, it decimated the towns and the agriculture of the area. Simon de Montfort, what's his name? Raymond VI manages, with the help of his brother-in-law, to win back some of the towns. So by the time you get to, I think it's 1229, finally a peace is signed. And you then get the worst part of this, which is the Inquisition. So the result of this crusade is the sort of end of a very flourishing culture, literary culture in many ways, the end of the Occitan language. People still exists underground, but it's no longer the official language, and the institution of the Inquisition, which of course then spread to Spain under the Dominicans, right? The Dominicans have their first monastery in Toulouse, built there particularly to work against the heresy of the Cathars. And this is the Jacobin monastery there. This is actually one of the towns that we'll go to, which is Cordes-sur-Ciel. And this sort of shows you these tiny little hilltop, built-up, fortified towns, which even now are very difficult to get to. You have to walk up something like this. I was sort of huffing and puffing to get there. And you can see, you know, it stands out of the clouds. Now, I now can get on to Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, we're looking now at Albi, which is, the name was given to the Albigensian crusade. The Albigeois really weren't Cathars. There were some amongst them. It's a misnomer, all right? There was a meeting of Cathars debating with the church near Albi, and that's why the Cathars were called that Albigeois group. Now here you have it dominated by the Cathedral of Saint-Cécile, which was built by the Catholic Church to mark the triumph of the Church over the heresy of the South, all right, which continues underground for a long time. And it's no coincidence that probably the greatest proportion of Protestants in France are in the South as well. There's always been this resentment of the North, and it's manifested often in resentment against the Church. So you have this massive cathedral which is built, and it's very, very different from the kind of Gothic cathedrals of the North with, you know, lacework and the spiring up to heaven. This is a massive, almost like a castle structure, a fortress really of the Church. You cannot miss the message when you actually visit this cathedral. Now, Albi also flourished at this time because of the development of woad. So we now go back to Raymond VI, whose descendant, of course, is no other than Toulouse-Lautrec. Now, Henri de Toulouse Lautrec Montfort, you can sort of see this accumulation of names because it's an accumulation of different territories which have been attracted to the name. Now, he's the last of his family. Now, he's always considered to be an aristocrat, right? Well, he belonged to a very wealthy family who had a lot of land and a lot of properties. But by the time you get down to the 1860s, the territories and the wealth, I suppose, of the Toulouse-Lautrec had been diminished considerably, and there were other branches of the family. So to some degree, he's sort of one of several sort of noble families related to the Toulouse-Lautrec. But what is important is that at the time of Napoleon Bonaparte, Napoleon starts a law which goes against the law of primogeniture. Up until then, in an aristocratic family, it was only the eldest son which inherited the lands, and this meant that the lands and the titles remained intact. Once this was destroyed, it meant, of course, that if you had several sons, forget about the daughters, the land gradually disappeared and in the will. So to go against this and to sustain the family lands, the different branches of the family married into each other. So what happens in the case of Toulouse-Lautrec, you have his mother and father being first cousins. That's the first thing. But his mother and his father also were both the issue of first cousins. So, in other words, his grandmothers were sisters. So it's a doubling or a quadrupling of this genetic pool, which already, if you look at the way in which people had intermarried all the way back, was extremely narrow. So this means that he will be crippled by a genetic disease which afflicts other members of his family, even though the family, of course, never actually want to acknowledge this. But this is a photo of Toulouse-Lautrec when he's about 4. He seems to be relatively well proportioned there, despite the fact that he's already in this ghastly get-up, and you really wonder when he sort of spends most of his life dressing up afterwards if this is what happened at the beginning. You see already, though, it wasn't just a matter of having very friable bones. It was a syndrome that relates also to his mouth. He had very large mouth, and he used to sort of dribble. So it wasn't just being very small. He wasn't a dwarf at all. He just was very small because of his legs. But also it also affected his genitalia as well. So there was, which I won't go into, but he spent a lot of his time as favourite at the local sort of brothel. Now, what happens, we will just move straight along from that. What happens when he's about 12 is that he, according to the family, he has a fall while on a horse. In actual fact, it didn't happen at all. They tried to make it look as though it was a noble, wound. He broke his legs twice and they didn't ever heal. And meant that his torso continued to grow, but his legs didn't, which meant that he would end up being about 5 foot, between 5 foot and 5'1". So a normal sort of torso, but you can see the very large lips already there. You have to remember, though, at the time that to get into the French army, you only had to be 5'1", which was why, of course, they had such a worry with the Germans across the border. I mean, the Germans, probably couldn't see the French army. I mean, really. So even though for us he looks minute, he really, at the time, it wasn't really small, and he certainly wasn't a dwarf. Now, if you actually look at the family, this is Toulouse-Lautrec about a couple of years before he dies. As I said, he dies at 37. You can see that other members of the family have the same problem. This little girl was 10, but her legs were so deformed that she was still being pushed round in a pram. This girl here, as you can see, has got her legs in calipers, and another one of his favourite cousins had already died from, had the legs which were small, but had died very prematurely, I think at the age of 20, mysteriously. So clearly it had affected many members of the family. His mother, whom he was very close to, and she was one of these hovering mothers, she felt great guilt at the fact that she possibly, because of the marriage with her own cousin, that she had brought this on her son. And so she's painted often by Toulouse-Lautrec. She was completely cross-eyed. I mean, she couldn't focus at all. So one of the reasons why he always shows her looking down or from profile is not to sort of show this sort of problem that she had. And then, of course, you get the father. Alphonse was sort of mad as a snake. He really, obviously, sort of bipolar. Here we have him driving a coach and four in Nice, standing up. There's the poor coachman trying to look sort of dignified as they race down the Promenade des Anglais. Loved dressing up. He's always up in the attic, dressed up with a falcon when he wasn't driving horses at breakneck speed. Even at the death of poor Toulouse-Lautrec, as he was dying, his father was trying to kill flies with a rubber band. So as you can see, genetically he really had a few problems. So whether he got the dressing up from his father, or he had an enormous wardrobe that he could work into, or whether he just simply was mocked so much by people that he decided he went in for self-mockery himself. So you get a number of photographs of him dressed up in outlandish outfits. Here he's dressed up as a choir boy. Here he's dressed up as a slave girl. Here he's dressed up as a Japanese. So it was sort of, you're going to make fun of me, I can do that too. In fact, I can do it better than you can. So it was a form of self-loathing, I suppose. But the other thing that's quite interesting, 2 points about this childhood that he had, was that they refused to believe that he couldn't be cured. And so he was taken from spa to spa with weights being put on his legs to try and make them grow. And he went through a lot of pain, and they gave him enormous amounts of morphine. And whether this was sort of the beginning of a kind of drug addiction, because he will quite early become an alcoholic. The other thing that's quite important is that he spends his life not out with the men. You know, the men were all out hunting, shooting, or dressing up, and he was left alone with this family, all related. You know, the aunts who were cousins, or else possibly sisters. Do you know what I mean? And he spends this time with the clock tick-tock, tick-tock, this feminine time to kill. And you're going to see this coming out in his brothel scenes. There's no one's having a good time. There's no nudge, nudge, wink, wink in his brothel scenes. It's people sitting around waiting for something to happen, you know. And this is very much a carryover from his youth. I just wanted to have this other look at the last member of the family, is that he had an extraordinarily tall cousin, he probably had something wrong with him as well, who will become a doctor, and he had Toulouse-Lautrec playing doctor with one of the great doctors at Saint-Louis. Now, the family realised that he would never really be able to, you know, take on the normal role of a count, in other words, be hunting with the pack and so on. And they call on the services of another unusual person who was a nobleman, Prince Tour, who was a great painter at the time, very well known, someone we've never heard about now, but is very well known at the time, a painter, equestrian painter, and a painter of hunting scenes. Now, he was influenced by the Barbizon school, in other words, the school, you think of Daubigny, Corot, and so on. You can see Corot's sort of translucent sort of mist, and the same kind of palette that was being used at this time. But the interesting thing about Prince Tour was he was a deaf mute. So you get this sort of crippled person with a deaf mute, and he will be the first teacher of Toulouse-Lautrec and remains a friend with him for the rest of his life. The last voyage that Toulouse-Lautrec will make will be in the company of Prince Tour. So you can see the influence of this sort of aristocratic style in the paintings that Toulouse-Lautrec will make. This is Toulouse-Lautrec's portrait of Prince Tour, very much the painter as dandy, all right? The painter as an acceptable social figure. And this is why, of course, the Toulouse-Lautrec decided they would allow him to paint, because, you know, if he was painting these aristocratic scenes, Prince Tour was a member of the Beaux-Arts, he was exhibited at the Salon. It was a respectable way to go for a cultured gentleman. So he has a shot at doing landscapes. Now, I trawled and trawled and trawled until I finally did find a landscape by Toulouse-Lautrec. And here it's around Céléron. His mother was the Countess of Céléron. And you can see he is using very much that Barbizon palette, the dark sort of, you know, the browns and the greens. But here is an impressionist influence, as you can see, with the brush strokes. You no longer have that smooth, seamless landscape. You have the idea of light falling on this being evoked in these 1880 vineyard scene. He continues to paint for a while in the style of Prince Tour. So here you have this sort of very much the aristocratic milieu, ladies driving, you know, their own little coaches, being greeted ceremoniously by someone on their own, you know, lands. And this is a little bit reminiscent of Courbet's Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet. Now, it's at this time that Prince Tour suggests that if he's to make any advance in his style, he really needs to go to Paris and paint there. So he goes up to Paris with Prince Tour and, of course, his mother. He really cannot shake his mother. And this will be one of his first self-portraits. Now, this is so different from the portraits that we're going to see later on. All right, still very much in this very dark palette with very much the impressionist style of painting. Now, he is set up in Paris with his mother, on the border between the 9th and the 2nd arrondissement. So this is a very respectable part of Paris. And he is enrolled in the studio of Léon Bonnat, who was a great society painter of the time. Now Bonnat, for one reason or another, takes a great dislike to Toulouse-Lautrec. He thinks he's a cheeky upstart who doesn't know how to behave, and in fact carries a sort of vendetta against him for life. I mean, he's one of the people who will stop him from actually being accepted by the Salon. Now you can see the kind of painting that he was, not what you think of as Toulouse-Lautrec, either subject matter or style. This would have been one of the leading Jewish families of the time, the Khans. There's a legacy of the Khans actually outside Paris. Now, he leaves that particular studio and is enrolled at the studio of Fernand Cormon, who is a much more sympathetic character, and whose specialty is Neanderthal men and biblical scenes. And he actually was given a large commission of the Museum of Natural History, where he's got a whole lot of Neanderthal paintings there, which again, it's really quite amusing in many ways, seeing where a painter comes from his inspiration. But it's during this time, even if he now learns the basic blocks of painting from him, that he joins this wild lifestyle of Montmartre. And here we have the studio of Cormon. There is Cormon sort of dealing out his teachings, with Toulouse-Lautrec seated in the foreground. And it's here that he will, of course, make the acquaintance of Van Gogh and Anquin as well. So a lot of those painters who will go on, some of them will become Fauvists, and of course Van Gogh as well, interested in colour. So you can imagine the very, very different outcomes from those rather strange scenes of Cormon. Now, where he is now living is, you see, he would have been staying with his mama around here, very sort of just around the Marais area, where he now has migrated right up in the 9th, right up to just below Montmartre in the Rue de la Fontaine, where he has his studio. And what's interesting about this, and some of you who've been to Paris with us will know, here we have the Gare Saint-Lazare. This street here is where Manet will have his studio, where he paints. This is where Caillebotte paints as well. Gare Saint-Lazare, you have Renoir and Monet having little apartments there. And just in the street next to the Cormon's studio, and where Toulouse-Lautrec lives, is the house and studio of Degas. And of course the Impressionist painters will meet in Pigalle, and all of their models that they will take, and the Moulin de la Galette and the Moulin Rouge. Moulin Rouge is of course just there, around the corner from where he lives, and the other cabarets are up here. So there's this geography that he now starts to frequent. So after he's had his sort of, lovely 3-course meal with his mother, he gets out and goes up to Montmartre and indulges in this alternate lifestyle. His mother doesn't seem to realise what's going on for an awfully long time, as most mothers don't, I might as a footnote. So here we have, he falls into two serious errors. The first one is the absinthe scene, right? Now absinthe, as you know, was a drink which becomes very popular from about 1840 onwards, hits its straps, I suppose, in the Belle Epoque, when the wine had become too expensive because of failure of the crops. It was a cheap drink that could be consumed. It was something like 70 or 80% proof of alcohol, so in other words, you could really get drunk very quickly. And it, of course, was supposed to have wormwood in it. Well, it did have wormwood in it, which was supposed to be a hallucinatory drug. The jury is still rather out on that one. The fact is that it was such a strong drink was enough to make you hallucinate whether it had anything in it or not. And the absinthe that was consumed on the outer boulevards in Montmartre wasn't a very high, pure brew. Now, it became a kind of the badge of Bohemia. All of the artists and the writers of the time drank absinthe. And Toulouse-Lautrec was so addicted that he even actually had a hollow cane in which he had his own absinthe. And he used to put pepper in with it. He used to have cocktail parties where he'd put cognac and absinthe and cayenne pepper in equal parts. I hate to think the effects of those parties. Anyway, he was a great cook. He actually invented the chocolate mousse. I mean, it's amazing the things that you find when you do these lectures. I mean, doing research myself. Anyway, this, of course, so many people died alcoholics, but it was often, Paul Verlaine, Guy de Maupassant, Baudelaire, but often they drank to alleviate the symptoms of the next thing we'll be looking at, which is syphilis. Anyway, by 1914, absinthe has been blamed for all of the ills of French society. The fact that that the French aren't producing enough children, that they're shorter than the Germans, that all of this it's all the problem. It's all the problem of absinthe, and so it becomes banned in 1914. And it's actually gone from being the green fairy, this enticing, seductive Eve of the drink, to becoming, the devil, basically. And of course, it's always seen as a woman. It's not my fault. I'm a drunk. It's the fault of absinthe. So this is where, in these absinthe bars, of course, he will meet and paint Van Gogh. And you'll see that in many of his paintings, the paintings of Toulouse-Lautrec, you have a green tinge, and this is a reference, overt reference to the consumption of absinthe. Absinthe often were called names like they're called a blue because it's green. You see, and or I'll have a perroquet. I'll have a parrot because parrots are green. Or I'll have a tax collector because tax collectors actually used to dress up in green uniforms. There's all this vocabulary. It was frightfully in to be drunk on absinthe. Now the other thing, and I'll have to shield your eyes if you don't want to watch this, was of course he then becomes a great habitué of the brothels there in Montmartre. Now remember that by this stage, like 90% of men frequented prostitutes in one form or another. It was considered perfectly normal. So there was a huge percentage of the working class population who made their living through prostitution. And this was the time where there was this great scare about syphilis. The medical profession had come out saying that syphilis was hereditary, all right? And remember, you've got Zola writing his great Rougon-Macquart talking about the hereditary effects of alcoholism, and syphilis was one of them. So whether it was hereditary or not, there was this huge scare, and instead of actually stopping people going to see prostitutes or closing down the brothels, it meant that they had to control prostitutes better. And you see, we'll see some of the paintings that Toulouse-Lautrec does of these women who have to go for their local medical visit. Now, you had all the prostitutes from absolutely every level, from the ones that served the army right to the very top, the great courtesans, the great horizontals, who entertained, of course, all the crowned heads of Europe, and, of course, had Napoleon III as a client. He was a great aficionado of courtesans, was our Napoleon III. Now, the real problem with this was that syphilis did enter the population. I think at this time, in about the 1890s, I think they thought that something like 20% of men had active syphilis, whatever that means. I think they've found out now that syphilis, the popular idea about syphilis was that it came across with Columbus, that he imported it after the conquest of the New World. But I think there's been a lot of research now. They've found syphilis in bones in ancient Rome, and they've actually found it in some monastery, would you believe, in the 13th century. So whether it was a new strain, one doesn't know. However, be it that it may, Toulouse-Lautrec very early catches syphilis. Now, when you think of all of the people that we talk about who've died of syphilis, Guy de Maupassant dies raving mad. At the time he was he was actually confined to a straitjacket. You have Baudelaire who dies of tertiary syphilis. He can't speak in the end. Paul Verlaine, the great poet. Manet dies of syphilis. So partly one of the reasons people drink is to alleviate the symptoms. The only cure at that time was mercury, and they used to have to sort of sit in a mercury steam bath. So if that didn't finish, the syphilis didn't get you, or the absinthe, the mercury steam bath did. All right, now he is very much influenced by Degas, whom he looks up to and who is his neighbour, and so he would meet him regularly and discuss ideas with him. Now, he's going to take on many of Degas' approaches to art and his subject matter, but in a much more sympathetic way. Toulouse-Lautrec, having spent so much time in the company of women, has much more of a sympathy for women. He doesn't, Degas, I suppose you could say, was a misogynist in some way. So in Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings, there's immense sort of feeling of connection with these unusual women that he paints. Now, what you have here is, of course, a woman bathing, but Degas is very beholden to the style of Japanese prints, where first of all you get things taken from an unusual angle. All right, we go into this virtually from the middle of the woman looking downwards. She's not recognisable as an individual. You know, she's just simply a shape in many ways against others. So you get this large shape against a round circle. You can see that that's being done. And also the perspective has been collapsed because she looks as though she's bigger because she happens to be nearer us, and so on. So this, of course, is typical of Impressionist painting, if you want. You know, there's no narration in it. It's one single moment. There's no individuality, and so on. Now, you'll see that Toulouse-Lautrec in 1889 chooses the same sorts of themes. Now, women who are faceless, again, their body is used as a shape. Again, this unusual perspective where you sort of are brought into the painting from above. This was sort of typical of these ukiyo-e paintings of Japanese prints. And again, a flattening of the background, which he'll carry to the furthest extent when he is doing his paintings, his posters. I better move along a bit. You're all, of course, familiar with the little dancer of Degas, representative of what he saw as the lower classes. You know, she's got the sort of low brow. He saw these little girls as you know, couldn't be anything else but, you know, dancers, or i.e. prostitutes in the making. Whereas you get Degas' painting of a little girl who is a ballet dancer, and there's something quite touching about it. It's very much a real gesture of a real person, you know, holding your skirt up with your, you know, it's obviously a very observed action. And you get something of the sense of the fragility and the youth of this little girl pulling up her tights. She's very proud of them, you know, possibly this is the, you know, the first pair of ballet tights she's ever had. Now, he's already experimenting with a style that he works in a lot, which is a cardboard background with pastel to give this sense of the light on the, or the lightness of the tutu. Now, in the 1890s, this is all as a result of his frequenting, by now, the Bohemian fringe. He becomes an absolute element of it. He lives inside it. He's no longer someone who's observing it as a social phenomenon. He is Bohemia himself. And he meets the great singer, or cabaret singer, Aristide Bruant, who starts out singing at the Black Cat, which was started by Salis, and then actually opens up the Black Cat, or at least the Miroton himself. Now, Bruant, as you know, actually wasn't from the working class. He's quite a savvy middle-class man who has certain, you know, socialist sympathies, and performs these songs. I haven't got one here, which are like hunting dirge, da 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 da. You know, they're all the same, very easy to sing along. All of which are about what is going on in the working class districts on the outskirts of Paris. Now, you remember that in the 1860s, Haussmann had annexed the villages of Paris, like Montmartre, Belleville, Grenelle, and so on, and they were forced to become Parisian. But there's still this very strong working class culture. And Bruant sings in working class slang. And in fact, he's such a businessman that he even manages to publish a dictionary of slang for the bourgeois that come and can't understand what he's singing about. But he becomes an absolute institution. He's very much like Barry Humphries. He insults the bourgeois who come in, oh, there you are, you pig, and so on. And they love it, they come up after being at the ballet and come up and, are insulted by Aristide Bruant, have a wonderful evening. Now, Bruant actually commissions Toulouse-Lautrec to do some posters to advertise his cabaret. And here you get the great influence of the Japanese prints again, the blocks of colour. Remember these prints that came over, often wrapping up the porcelain that was being imported from Japan. So great blocks of colour with black, red and black against a pale background. And in fact, it was so effective as a kind of logo that Bruant could even have himself from the back. He just became recognisable by these shapes. He asks then Toulouse this is the Chat Noir, which no longer exists, this is the inside of it. As you can see, people absolutely outrageous. They had outrageous cabarets. They had the cabaret of hell with big hell, and they had the cabaret of heaven with angels floating around, and the waiters were all dressed up as angels. It was really quite a happening time. He actually asked Toulouse-Lautrec to decorate his cabaret for him. And each of his songs, Bruant's songs, were to one of these areas, like Batignolles. And so Toulouse-Lautrec does a painting, which is a woman, which relates to Batignolles. And they're hung up around the cabaret. And so this is the sort of first showing, I suppose, of his work. And this is many of these painters. For example, we saw last week that Van Gogh begins his career having his work shown in the Tabourin Cafe. This is him being photographed at the Merliton with Salis. Well, we now go to the Moulin Rouge, of course, as you know, which is on the Boulevard de Clichy, I think, isn't it? Rochefort and Clichy. And he is a great habitué of this, and he shows himself. This is the other thing is interesting about Toulouse-Lautrec. He actually shows himself integrated into this environment. It's no longer someone like Renoir looking at it from the outside. It's from the inside as well. So here, first of all, you have the influence in his paintings now of the Japanese print. All right, the idea of perspective being given by a large object which is in the foreground, which is this piece of wood here, and also this way in which people are not perfectly set into the middle of the painting. This also comes from Japanese prints, and you can see this woman's had her face cut off. So it's almost like a photograph, from it. You just happen to have the lens and you just take what is there. You don't attempt to create a harmonious scene with vanishing points and so on. In fact, the vanishing point is really rather odd, and in fact you will remember the scene of the cafe of Van Gogh last week. So all of this is one of the performers, May Belfort, who has this grotesque face. Now this is this idea of the grotesque nature of this counterculture. All right, he's often described as having lived with outcasts. That's not what it is. I mean, he lives on the edge. People who are living between identities. He's interested in prostitutes or courtesans, which are they? Are they actually courtesans or are they honest women? Lesbians, who push prostitution into another area as well, performers, and these women in particular. So here you have another great performer, La Goulue. He's his very tall cousin, remember, Céron, who is about 6'3", and then there's little Toulouse-Lautrec himself. This is Jeanne Avril here. This is one of the girlfriends. This is the cheesy girl, La Mon Fromage. I just want to quickly go through some of the performers who he is fascinated with. He knows these women, but not only are they completely different from women of bourgeois women of the time. You've got, the woman, the bourgeois housewife at home, in her corset, in the boudoir, representing the male wealth, the virtue of society. Here you've got women who are out there earning their living, not just occasionally going out into town, but dancing and kicking up their skirts and having nothing underneath. and also living so much on the edge that you're actually sexually on the edge as well. You know, they've gone across genders to such a degree that they actually have open lesbian relationships. And here she is with the Môme Fromage, who was her girlfriend of the time. Now, practically all the performers that he paints are well-known lesbians, practically all of them. She was, of course, known, she was called La Goulue because she was fat. She was the greedy one. And so this is her trademark, eating and drinking. She used to sort of, you know, finish off other people's plates of food, and eventually gets so tubby. I mean, let's face it, it's not at all what you imagine when you think of these long, lanky singers from the Moulin Rouge, is it? Who, by the way, are all Australians. Very, very tubby. But I suppose that helps you get your legs up in the air. I don't know, that's my excuse anyhow. Now here you have him photographed in her company as well. Now, La Goulue had started off creeping down the hill from her mother's laundry, getting dressed up in the clothes that had been left in the laundry, becomes very wealthy, celebrated dancer, manages to make it from Montmartre down to the Champs-Élysées, to the Ambassadeur. It's the great, you know, you've made it if you perform there. Gets too fat and can't dance, and ends up in a kind of little caravan in a local show outside Paris, and asks her friend Toulouse Lautrec to actually do these paintings, which are in the Musée d'Orsay, which she puts on either side of this little caravan. And here you have her dancing in the old glory days, but the people around it are very important. Here you have Fainéant, who is a well-known anarchist. So in other words, Toulouse-Lautrec was, again, in this politically edgy group as well. You know, this sort of so-called son of an aristocratic family, very close to Fainéant, who was actually supposed to have tried to leave a bomb to blow up members of parliament. Here you have Jeanne Avril and Oscar Wilde. Again, of course, someone who was living very much on the edge in Paris at the time. The French actually welcomed him. They were appalled by the way in which he had been prosecuted in England. The other person who was a well-known lesbian dancer was, of course, Jeanne Avril, and he is going to inspire Toulouse-Lautrec with this poster which has a lot of elements of Art Nouveau in it. It's not just the Japanese prints, but it's these extraordinary emphasis on lines. And this is really this wavy line that Toulouse-Lautrec will cultivate in the last 5 years of his life are a bit of a write-off. He's painting from memory, more or less, but in his high period, this control of the line, which almost is going to sort of break. You get this dynamism and movement which is integrated in it. And the elegance of Jeanne Avril, who started out at the Salpêtrière, where she'd been interned for psychiatric disorders and used to dance as therapy. She was quite a cultured woman. She had her own, you know, circle of literary people, and even had a relationship with the grandson of Wordsworth, which is where she gets her name Avril, O to be in England now that April's there. So there she is dancing. Now you see very clearly here the way in which he has now mastered this art of actually just with one element, or two elements, I suppose, getting the movement of the legs, but also the individual faces of these people. Even though all the rest of it looks the same, you can see the sort of concentration and the dour sort of expression on her face. She's a bit more easygoing, but all the different shapes, very cleverly caught. He also dresses up as Jeanne Avril as well. Now the other person, I won't speak so much, I haven't got time to look at her very much, but the way in which he is now capturing the essence of the singer Yvette Guilbert, who used to dress up like a school teacher and then get up and sing the most obscene songs in this piping little voice. But he's managed to make her, he's got the essence of her, these long black gloves and the way in which she used her arms, and the emphasis. She used to have a lot of strange makeup on, but he makes her look about 100 years older, and she wasn't too happy when she actually saw these, by the way. There you have what she actually looked like and the way in which he portrays her with these, the arms. The other people whom he painted, again, well-known lesbian dancers. Here we have a lesbian couple. This was the dancer Shao Kao, who also gets too fat and becomes a clown. There's hope for all of us. Again, another cabaret dancer, Chocolate, again, a Negro who danced. So do you know what I mean? He doesn't just take anyone. It's always people who are also sort of living out a difficult existential existence. I'll just quickly move on. I wanted to talk briefly about the Moulin de la Galette, the way in which he manages to sort of take the joy out of these paintings. I'll probably be about another 10 minutes. I'll go about 5 minutes over. You remember Renoir's painting, of course, it's all sunlight and dappling and people courting. No one seems to be enjoying themselves at all here. We've got the people here waiting, as everyone does in Toulouse-Lautrec's paintings. They're waiting for something to happen, a certain sense of boredom. Again, we're cut off from this no man's land by this rather anonymous piece of furniture. And people aren't even having a good time over here. Someone's being arrested. So it's all a little bit dark apart from anything else. And here it's hardly sort of, erotic, nudge, nudge, wink, wink with the woman about to kick up her heels. You really wonder if it would be worth watching when she kicks up her heels. I mean, she looks like a bit of a solid citizen. There's nothing particularly sort of saucy about this. It's very much the sort of, everyday, routine as it is. I might just move on. I just wanted to compare these two paintings, this sort of slightly sort of melancholy view that Toulouse-Lautrec has of life. This is his mistress, whom he almost married, Suzanne Valadon, whom he shows us with a hangover, but also a very independent woman staring life, in the face. She has to earn her own living. It's not easy. The same woman painted by Renoir. She was also the mistress of Renoir. And there, of course, you get this sort of, seductive young lady who's sort of, caressing her own hair, inviting us to caress her hair as well. You really couldn't get a more different take on the same person. Now, these brothel scenes are the ones that I think I really wanted to look at. This is this idea of waiting. Now, the Rue des Moulins was a well-known high-class brothel, actually near the Bibliothèque Nationale, you'll be pleased to hear. It had a special doorway so you could drive your coach in, you didn't want to be seen knocking at the door or anything. And here he has this idea of boredom, of time going by, that even the madam is looking quite respectable but bored. Here's a lady over here, just almost out of the picture plane, sort of showing her wares, so as to speak, but there's no emphasis on that. The emphasis is basically on these women together, this sort of camaraderie of women together, waiting for something to happen. And here we have a photograph that he has taken of himself. Now, when he actually doesn't paint himself into paintings, he often has a photograph of himself in a painting, or actually, I don't have time to do this, so I don't have the paintings, the photos with me, but he'll often have his head photographed so it looks as though it's in the painting. So here you have this woman here who modelled for the lady there. This is also some of the tricks that he does with photography. He was very interested in this sort of thing. I just wanted to show you again, he began to live in one of the brothels. He was lucky insofar as men weren't allowed to do that, but because he was sort of between categories in many ways, he actually had a room with his own easels, and there, what does he depict? Does he depict these saucy goings-on? Not at all. Here we have women in their dressing gown who sort of look like, Auntie May and Auntie Flo, basically, having their lunch, chatting away, killing time before the evening. Gosh, when does work start? Oh, 7 o'clock. Oh, gosh, I hope so-and-so is not going to come, and so on. And, the madam herself hardly looks an imposing figure. She's also just having a glass of wine. Here you have people killing time again, playing cards. But what you have here in his style is very much this now flattening out of the plane, and also very much the use of outlines that he, of course, uses in his posters, but now is used in his art as well. I just wanted to show you his take on lesbianism. Lesbianism was one of the big sort of things of the time. It was called, I can't remember the name, Tribaldism. But he actually shows these women embracing. Of course, there were a great number of women who were openly lesbians dancing here at the Moulin de la Galette. But in the brothels, it was really possibly just a form of human affection. They would have been a bit sick of men by then. And you get these very overt paintings of women involved with each other. But what I wanted to really show you, this is apart from this interest in same-sex relations that you see all through his paintings, is this use of line, an outline, which he develops more and more towards the end of his life, even in the pastels that you have here. So you get the lines coming round and gradually in towards the two faces and the two people kissing. The other thing, of course, is this emphasis on these great flat planes of colour, which, as I said, influences very much poster production from then onwards, and also has an effect on Fauvist painting, which was about line and large pieces of colour. Well, in 1901, after having been interned for a while in a sanatorium, his friends had, he really was ravaged by syphilis, tertiary syphilis, and particularly by alcoholism. He drank day and night, whether it was because of his feelings of inadequacy, because of his physique, or it was to disguise the effects of syphilis. We don't know, but he dies finally at his mother's estate near Bordeaux, again with his mother. Now, it's sort of ironic that no one really wanted to set up or accept his paintings. Remember, we had this problem with Caillebott's legacy of Impressionist paintings, which he left to the state, and the state just said, well, no thanks. And it's really due to Renoir, who was one of his legates, who actually finally gets some of those paintings into what is now the collection of the Musée d'Orsay. Well, ironically, for a painter, the great painter of drugs and prostitutes and performers and women behaving badly, finally his mother will find a home for his collection, which will be in Albi, the town in which he was born, in no other place but the Archbishop's palace, which is extraordinarily ironic. And so this is where you have the most amazing collection of Toulouse-Lautrec's works, all these pieces right from the beginning, right through to his final works. And in fact, almost everything seems to be there. And he had stipulated in his will that he didn't want his collection to be dissipated. So then we have what was his art. I mean, in many ways from courtesans, at least from courtly princesses to courtesans. We have the tracing his career. Here, this wonderful image, I think, of Jeanne Avril, where you have everything is stripped down to its absolute minimum, and you just get the sense of grace and the sense of movement coming from the colours and the line here. And I don't know whether I'm pushing it a bit far, but in the Musée des Augustins in Toulouse, there is the most wonderful 15th century Madonna who sort of leans in very much in the same directions. Now, I'm not saying that he was influenced by it, but I'm really trying to tie in, I suppose, this career of this extraordinary man who sort of has in his history, in the history of the land that he represents, all of these elements. So in this series then we've really looked at the effect of landscape and vegetation and history on the works of these artists who are the great creators at the beginning of the 21st century. Thank you very much.